BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Monday, another Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? I hope everyone had a good weekend. On Mondays I talk to you guys about the Zodiac Killer, an unidentified serial killer who operated in California in 1968 and 69. Whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about the Zodiac Killer. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Box Ned. In addition to being a serial killer, the Zodiac also wrote letters. He designed ciphers, cryptograms, diagrams, and greeting cards. This is really one of the most cryptic mysteries in the entire world. And there are lots of Zodiac suspects that I've talked to you guys about over the years, but one that has made a very large impact in recent times has been Donald Lee Cheney, who's going to be the focus of this episode. Now, Donald Lee Cheney is the subject of the book Sighting In on the Zodiac Killer by Drew Beeson, but of course, many people over the years have suspected Don Cheney, and also when the 2007 documentaries came out, his name was Arthur Lee Allen, as well as This Is the Zodiac speaking. A lot of people became very suspicious because of some of the bizarre comments that were made by this individual, Don Cheney, as well as just going back to his interview with Tom Voigt even, and looking at the similarities between Don Cheney's handwriting and the Zodiac Killer's handwriting, so people have had Don Cheney on the radar for a while. He is perhaps best known as the friend of Arthur Lee Allen, the prime suspect in the Zodiac Killer mystery, and the reason why I wanted to do this episode is because a new article came out in the San Diego Reader discussing Don Cheney as a Zodiac Killer suspect, and I would like to read that for you. So firstly, we have, once again, the San Diego Reader. Donald Lee Cheney was the man who alerted the Pomona police way back in 1970 that he feared his friend Arthur Lee Allen was the Zodiac Killer, who murdered at least 5 people in the Bay Area in the late 1960s, and who may have killed many more. Cheney mentioned comments made by Allen that eerily echoed passages in the taunting letters the Zodiac wrote about his crimes, as well as a Zodiac watch worn by Allen. Police eventually found reason to serve search warrants, and for most investigators, became convinced that Arthur Lee Allen was the Zodiac Killer, although he was never charged with any of the Zodiac crimes. Donald Lee Cheney was even accused by some of being the Zodiac himself. I already thought that Don Cheney's daughter, whom we're going to call DCD, stand for Don Cheney's daughter, was the one of the most interesting people that I had ever met, before she told me about her dad. I met her in the late 1970s before Robert Graysmith's 1986 book first pointed the finger at Allen. Saying that Graysmith's book pointed the finger at Allen, I have to throw in this interjection. Well, this article states in its own way that Allen was a suspect years before 1986, that Don Cheney brought him forward as a suspect. He alerted the police, and also that the police were looking into Allen for over a decade prior to Graysmith publishing his book in 1986. So Graysmith definitely wasn't the first. And long before John Carroll Lynch portrayed Arthur Lee Allen in David Fincher's 2007 Zodiac film. But even back then, DCD, that's Don Cheney's daughter, was convinced. I thought it had to be Lee for 55 years now, she told me recently. Don Cheney's daughter recalled, I think the last time I saw Lee was when my dad and I went on a fishing trip on a boat in the summer or early fall of 1967. For some reason, my mom and brother didn't go with us that time. I remember parts of that day extremely well. It was the first time that I was going to have my very own fishing pole. Okay, it was my mom's white fishing pole, but since she wasn't coming, it has to be my pole for the day. I was so excited. I remember Lee driving and towing his boat. When we got to the water, we discovered that my fishing pole was gone. It must have fallen out on the way. I went from being so happy, anticipating fishing with my own pole, to completely devastated. I cried so hard, and I remember so clearly how disappointed I was. But beyond that, I was terrified that I was going to be in big trouble because I lost my mom's pole. It's funny how we remember certain things so clearly, and other things we forget. Don Cheney's daughter recalled, I think last time I saw Lee was when I was with my dad and we were on the boat. And there were 2 other things that involved Lee. It was a day or 2 later I told my parents Uncle Lee touched my bottom. I do not remember that, and I don't remember saying that, but according to my mom, that was the last time I saw Lee. After I said that, we never saw him again. As far as my mom knows, my dad only saw Lee once after that, on January 1st of 1968. In October of last year, Netflix brought renewed interest into the famously unsolved case of the Zodiac Killer, and they launched a documentary called This is the Zodiac Speaking. The title is taken from his letters, but it had an unpleasant significance for Don Cheney's daughter. If you watch the series, you may think you heard Don Cheney's voice on an original police interview tape saying that the last time he saw Lee was in 1969. I had met Cheny a few times, and even though I thought it was his voice at first, I soon decided that it was someone attempting to sound like him, reading aloud from a transcript. Don Cheney's daughter concurred. That was not my dad's voice that was used in the documentary. It is someone reading from the transcript from what I believe is the interview my dad did with Tom Voigt in 2000. The fake voice says, "disturbed spirit." The Voigt interview is the only place I ever heard my dad use that phrase. Both Tom Voigt and Zodiac author Robert Graysmith claimed the last time my dad saw Lee was in 1969, but it was January 1st, 1968. I think Tom Voigt has addressed that over the years. But back to the article. My dad started a new job in Pomona in late January of 1968. He bought a house in Pomona on Levita Avenue. I started kindergarten in 1968 at Arroyo Elementary School. Lee's new Zodiac watch was still in the package. It came in from Christmas 1967. You can read the original police reports. Getting known facts wrong intentionally really chaps my hide. And this is something that Drew Beeson has talked about a lot on his show, The Zodcast. Once again, he's the author of Sighting In on the Zodiac Killer, and perhaps the loudest voice about how Don Cheney could have been the Zodiac. And he does address this very frequently, that Lee Allen received the watch in 1967. The last meeting was January 1st of 1968. And this becomes very important because it's how the narrative has been shared to the general public. There is this widely believed story that is most likely false about how Arthur Lee Allen and Don Cheney met up on January 1st of 1969, and he's talking about how he wants to commit murders and use the name Zodiac. But that conversation either did not happen, or if anything, it may have happened a year before that. But I tend to think on the former side that most likely that conversation just did not happen, and I also do not think that there were any meetings with Don Cheney and Arthur Lee Allen in 1969. The discrepancy matters because it led Zodiac investigators, both amateur and professional, to accuse Don Cheney of changing his story. But Don Cheney's daughter said, "My dad only became confused about the year more than 3 decades later when Tom Voigt convinced him that it must have been 1969. Before that, it was always 1968. In fact, he said 1968 in the Voigt interview, before being convinced otherwise. My dad remembers helping Lee move after he lost his teaching job. Because of this, Tom Voigt said it must have been 1969 because Lee didn't get fired until the spring of 1968. But the thing is, Arthur Lee Allen was fired more than once from teaching." And I think that that's a very simple thing to clear up, and most likely that's what it would be referring to. And as I said before, I think Tom Voigt has addressed this in the past. Arthur Lee Allen taught at Travis Elementary School, Travis Air Force Base in California, until reportedly being fired in 1963 for having a loaded weapon in his car. Then in 1966, Allen began teaching at Valley Springs Elementary School in Valley Springs, California, where his teaching career is said to have ended in 1968 for doing something bad to a student, being careful with my language. My dad helped Lee move after he was fired from the Travis teaching job, not the Valley Springs teaching job. Don Cheney's daughter wants the record corrected for the sake of her father's reputation. In the interview with Tom Voigt, Cheney brings up the incident between Lee and his daughter, and this caused many people to chatter online about why Cheney would even stay friends with Allen after he did something so terrible. And yes, this really does come up. I mean, even if you go back to my book discussion on Sighting In on the Zodiac Killer, just asking the question, I mean, you might even wonder that yourselves. How could that be true? Some guy molests someone's daughter, and then he remains friends with him for 6 months. It just is just outlandish. So let's see how she's going to try and clear this up. He didn't remain friends," said Don Cheney's daughter. "After I said Lee touched my bottom, my mom, my brother, and I never saw him again. That was probably the summer or early fall of 1967. My dad only saw Lee once after that, a few months later, and that was on New Year's Day in 1968. When he got home, he told my mom he didn't want to see Lee ever again, and he didn't. Well, even if he's meeting up with him one time after this incident takes place, I mean, I don't know all the details of their conversation during that meeting, but that is a little bit shocking in itself. The belief that Don Cheney changed his story has led some people to suspect the man himself. One YouTuber has built a channel and written a book about Cheny, proposing that he is either the real Zodiac Killer or was Alan's accomplice. Well, I wonder who that could be. The YouTuber tracked down Don Cheney's daughter online with photos that he took from the Facebook page, cropped her out, and were used on his YouTube channel. I've seen his crop version spread all over the place with me cropped out, and people are talking about how shifty my dad looks. I prefer the truth of the full pictures, but how to do that without jumping into the fray of the comments section? After the true crime crowd got hold of the alleged discrepancy, they were loath to let it go. Online debates raged over why Cheney waited years before notifying the police of his suspicions about Alan. He didn't, said Don Cheney's daughter. It was less than 3 months from the time that my dad suspected Lee until he went to the police. My dad didn't become aware that Lee might have been the Zodiac until the middle of October 1969, after he read an article in the LA Times that quoted, talking about picking kids off as they come bouncing off the bus. He remembered Lee saying exactly the same thing. My dad wasn't the kind of person to jump to conclusions, and with such serious accusations, he wanted to be careful. He thought about it. His suspicions were based mostly on events from nearly 2 years before that he had tried to put out of his mind. But before speaking to law enforcement, he talked with my mom when they thought I was out of earshot. I was well aware of what the adults were saying, and they said the most interesting things when they thought there were no kids around. Oh, isn't it? That's the truth. That's the truth. I often sat quietly listening to the grown-ups talking in hushed tones, and they were talking about what happened on New Year's Day in 1968. They talked about the time Lee showed my dad how you could tape a flashlight to a gun and use it in the dark, something that was a method that was reportedly used by the Zodiac. They discussed the fact that Lee was extremely vindictive, and it might be dangerous for our family if Lee went to the police. Oh, it might be dangerous for our family if my dad went to the police about Lee. They talked about doing the right thing. In the end, Cheney did wait, but not for years. He waited until after the holidays. It was a busy time of year: Halloween, Thanksgiving, my 6th birthday, Christmas, and New Year's. He wanted to be sure. He waited until he could talk to his friend, Lee's brother, and the best man at my parents' wedding. Don Cheney had once in fact been friends with Arthur Lee Allen's brother. Lee's brother and sister-in-law came to our house in Pomona and sat at the kitchen table. I hid around the corner listening. My dad recounted his last visit with Lee, about how he had gone over to Lee's basement and found him writing thank you notes for the birthday and Christmas cards, and Lee had asked him to help by putting stamps on the envelopes. This will become very important for the reasons why people suspect Arthur Lee Allen and Don Cheney and vice versa, because Don Cheney said that he may have licked the stamps, and for starters, that means that there might not be an enormous amount of DNA that can be collected from the Zodiac Killer's letters, and in fact, what some people really thought was going to be the answer to this case was obtaining saliva DNA from the envelopes and the stamps. But even this article here says that Arthur Lee Allen never licked envelopes or stamps because he hated the taste of glue. And it appears that Don Cheney's daughter is corroborating that. But this is going to jump ahead a little bit in the story, because I'm going to go back and look at this quotation here. They talked about a time that Lee had been visiting them in Pomona. If he had gone south instead of north when he left, it put him in exactly the right place at the right time for the couple that was killed on a beach in San Diego, February 5th, 1964, and it is already suspected that that was the Zodiac Killer. Of course, February 5th, 1964, that is referring to the Swindle murders, the murders of Johnny Ray and Joyce Swindle, and then they also knew that he was in Riverside for the races when that girl was killed at the library on October 30th of 1966. That, of course, is Sherry Jo Bates. They talked about another couple on the beach with a shack. They knew that Lee was in the area at that time, June 4th, 1963. That would be the Domingos Edwards murders. And there seemed to be many couples killed on beaches, and several times unsolved murders happened when Lee was visiting Southern California. They talked for quite a while, and there was a lot of stuff that Lee had in common with the Zodiac. They couldn't find any evidence that would rule Lee out. When they were done talking, Lee's brother said he absolutely could not be the one to turn his own brother in for this, but he wouldn't hold it against my dad if he did. and that was when he went to the police and they came to question him, he would answer honestly. After that, my dad felt he had no other option but to tell the police. It would be pretty unlikely for it not to be Lee, all things considered. On January 10th of 1970, Don Cheney drove to Pomona to the police station to talk about his suspicions. Don Cheney's daughter was 6 years old. She recalled being with her dad on that day. My mom and brother and myself waited in the car. When my dad got back in the car, he said, "Well, that's going in the round file." And that really stuck with me because I had no idea what a round file was, but I remember leaning forward and asking, "What's a round file?" And apparently, the round file means a trash can. Donald Cheney didn't talk only to the Pomona police. When nothing came of that, my dad called our former neighbor from Concord. He was a cop with either the San Francisco Police Department or Concord PD, and this guy knew my dad to be trustworthy and took him seriously. His commanding officer, however, did not. He said, "Everyone is turning in everyone," and nothing more happened. The Netflix documentary has Graysmith getting a sequence of events backwards with a notable error. He says Concord, then Pomona, and it was the other way around. Well, Graysmith was never very big on sticking to the facts, and also I realized long ago that Robert Graysmith was just trying to be a wild storyteller. But the focus of this article is about why Don Cheney was not the Zodiac Killer, and it sounds like the only real piece of evidence that they're offering is, or it's not even a piece of evidence, the challenge that Don Cheney's daughter is saying, "No, my father wasn't the Zodiac Killer." Well, why wasn't your father the Zodiac Killer? Because the Zodiac Killer was Arthur Lee Allen. She thinks that Allen was the Zodiac, and lots of people do. Lots of people put Allen in the focus, or he's at the top of their suspect lists. I have expressed my doubts about Arthur Lee Allen many times on this channel, and he's one that really did not stand out to me too well. Now let's talk about some reasons why Don Cheney could be the Zodiac. Let's offer some counter-arguments, if you will. One of the things that Drew Beeson has talked about that sounds very, very interesting is that on September 27th of 1969, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were approached by the Zodiac at Lake Berryessa. He wore the hooded costume with the executioner-style hood, and the Zodiac symbol was on it. He had the clip-on sunglasses. But there's a very odd detail about the costume, and they're saying that they could see the hair underneath the black sunglass was worn by the Zodiac Killer, almost as if he had long brown hair that they could see behind the lens. And we've talked about this a lot on some other Zodiac programs, specifically the panel discussion show on Mysteries with Mr. Belgique, where I was discussing this with Druser and stating that, is it possible that that wasn't actually hair but the fabric of the costume? I mean, maybe. But what's really interesting about Don Cheney's physical appearance is he has a very strong receding hairline, one that's way more intense than the Presidio Heights composite sketch, and he had the type of hair that would have gone down in that direction. He had the type of hair that would get blocked by the lens or by the clip-on sunglasses. So that's just one thing that I noted there. But of course, I had to contact Drew Beeson and ask him about, hey, what do you think about this article in the San Diego Reader that is saying all these things about, no, Don Cheney wasn't the Zodiac? And also, I think that the major focus from Don Cheney's daughter is she's trying to say, my father wasn't a bad person. He had genuine suspicions about Arthur Lee Allen. He waited about 3 months before he contacted the police department, and they didn't hear him out immediately, or they didn't take his suspicions seriously immediately. So Drew responded by saying, "Hi Ned, I definitely don't want to fan any flames. I did read the article. It did not do any favors for the defense of Don Cheney whatsoever, and there is even a photo that Drew is going to share. As per the article, this was taken in December of 1968, right around the time of Lake Herman Road. Don's daughter states twice that she has no recollection of Arthur Lee Allen touching her bottom. By Don's own admission, he stayed friends with Allen after the alleged touching incident, which according to Don happened in 1967. She was probably too young to remember, but wouldn't someone tell her? If the incident did happen, fortunately, it didn't go too far and would not traumatize her as a teen or an adult." And I talked about that in the article. I talked about all of these things when I was reading the article to you guys just a few minutes ago. Firstly, that she appears to remember an enormous amount about that day that she spent with Arthur Lee Allen, losing the white fishing pole and crying, but she stated very clearly that she does not remember any type of touching incident. It was her mother that told her about it. And I mean, you can take that for what you will, but she also states that Don Cheney did meet with Arthur Lee Allen after the alleged touching incident on January 1st of 1968. And I openly told you guys, I thought that's very weird. I don't know if that was a friendly meetup or what on earth could have been happening with that. But if you actually think that someone molested your daughter to have any type of arranged, organized meetup or function or whatever they were doing together, that sounds pretty fishy. So Drew has written some things out here. He says, here are my questions. If Don was so certain that Arthur Lee Allen was the Zodiac, why did he wait until July 1971 to come forward? Was the case not covered in Los Angeles media? The Zodiac even wrote one specifically to the LA Times. Don comes forward over a year and a half after the murder of Paul Stein. Why the wait? Well, according to his daughter, she states that he went to the Pomona Police Department in 1970. Number two, what evidence is there that Don went to the Pomona Police Department? Why would he report it to his local police department that was 6 hours away from the Bay Area? I live in Houston, Texas. Would I report a murder I saw in Los Angeles to the Houston police? Great question, Drew. And I do mean that. That's an excellent question. Does that not cast some room for doubt? Does that not make people suspicious? Does that not get people wondering, well, how beneficial would it be to go to the Pomona Police Department for something about the Zodiac Killer that would be involved in the Bay Area? No, it's probably just something to the effect of that Don is married, he has young children, he is probably trying to make life work in California, and it was probably impractical to go in person to the Bay Area if he was trying to just share this type of information. So he did something that he thought could have been the best action at the time, and I'm just trying to answer this as a challenge question. I don't really know what Don was thinking, but why would he go to the Pomona Police Department? It might not be the most beneficial thing to do. And also, you heard from the article that he said his statements are going in the round file meaning the trash can. So number three, why did Don change his timeline from when he said Allen told him that he would become the Zodiac Killer from New Year's Day 68 to New Year's Day 1969? Well, according to the article, Don Cheney's daughter has her own idea. She thinks that Tom Voigt convinced him during the interview that it was January 1st of 1969, not January 1st of 1968, and the reason why was because Allen was fired from a teaching job, but he was fired from the job at Travis Elementary first, and then the job from Valley Springs, and she provided that explanation about how Don Cheney helped his father move after the Travis firing, not the Valley Springs firing, so he was fired from more than one teaching job. So when someone would say, well, there's no possible way it could be at this time because the meeting happened after he was fired from the job, fired from the teaching job. Well, he was fired more than once in his life, so more than one firing, it was an earlier meetup. We also covered that one, but I mean, I also have to give my own take on the subject, my own immediate responses, because when you read a book like Zodiac Unmasked, it is just filled with these wild stories of Donald Lee Cheney, just telling stuff all about Arthur Lee Allen and all about these anecdotes on how he's trying to become a serial killer, and he's using all of these Zodiac terminologies. My honest take is, I think that Don may have fibbed a little bit. His daughter's trying to make him look like the absolute best person in the world, someone who's honest, caring, just trying to do the right thing because he had genuine suspicions about Arthur Lee Allen being the Zodiac Killer. But my interpretation of Don Cheney in the past was that he was someone who told a bunch of wild stories, maybe even inconsistent at some point. It seems like he enjoys telling these wild stories, wants to get stuff put into Graysmith's book, and also he doesn't mind fudging the details every now and then. And some people think that he just liked the attention, but he definitely didn't go extremely big with the attention. So it's kind of like, it's a very bizarre thing, but the fact of the matter is, I don't think that Don Cheney was always telling the truth. I think he made some of this stuff up. So for him to just do that on his own, change the story saying the last time he saw Lee was January 1st of 69, part of me was wondering, did he do that because he thought that it would make for a better Zodiac story? Number 4 is, We now know the Zodiac watch was a Christmas gift from 1967 as per Ron Allen, who got the identical watch. We know that that is changing, and not so much of a question, but that's a fact that, as I said, Drew Beeson's talked about that a lot on the Zodcast, and I also don't dispute that, and I mean, Don Cheney's daughter also doesn't dispute that. She said that in 1967 he had the watch in the box. And one more. This is a question. If Allen was the Zodiac Killer, why spend so much time on encryption like the Z32 just to blab it all to Don Cheney? It makes no sense at all. And that could also be some wild storytelling from Don, but what the narrative is, what I think that the mainstream narrative is that Arthur Lee Allen wanted to confess things to someone. He wanted to share personal information, and this is a hypothetical. Let's look at how some people understand the Zodiac Killer story. Don Cheney and Arthur Lee Allen meet on January 1st of 1969, and Lee Allen is saying, I'm going to become a serial killer. I'm going to use the name Zodiac. I'm going to target people at random. They'll never figure it out. This is how I'm going to do it. He just had to tell someone. Now, that is again something that's popularly believed about the Zodiac and popularly believed about Arthur Lee Allen. But do I believe that? No, absolutely not. I don't think that those things actually happened. And okay, though, what I really want to point out that Don Cheney's physical appearance could really alter, and it is shocking just how much someone can change by growing out their hair and growing a mustache. So the photos from Don in the late 60s and early 1970s are just extremely different than when he grew out his hair in the 1970s. I would never have known that this was the same person. But that also goes to show that Don Cheney could grow long hair, and he had the type of hair that might be seen at Lake Berryessa. The Zodiac was reported to have had a full head of brown hair at Lake Berryessa. Don Cheney had brown hair, whereas Lee Allen did not. So then people start making the assumption that, well, he must have been wearing a wig. And I get asked that question all the time. Do you think the Zodiac Killer was wearing a wig at Lake Berryessa? My answer is no, because I think that people are using that as a way to force Arthur Lee Allen into the Zodiac narrative, because without that assumption, Lee Allen doesn't work as a Zodiac Killer suspect. He was balding in 1968 and 69, and he definitely did not have a giant full head of brown hair. So somebody like Don Cheney would work, Richard Gaikowski would work, even Lawrence Kane would work. Those men have definitely the hair aspect lined up. But Drew Beeson has one more comment here when he says, one more. If Cheny was sure that Arthur Lee Allen was going to act on what he told him, kill couples at lovers' lanes, and Cheny says to Arthur Lee Allen something like, you better think hard before you act on this plan, wouldn't Don Cheney be monitoring the news and looking for things like the Blue Rock Springs attack or reading or hearing about the letters? He admits to still being in contact with Ron Allen in the early 1970s. Ron was Cheney's best man at Cheney's wedding in Pomona. Wouldn't he ask Ron about Arthur Lee Allen and tell him what he said that day and later go ask what's going on in Vallejo? Those are also some good questions, and those are some very insightful things that Drew has brought up, meaning that if Don actually believed all these stories, or if everything that Don said was true, wouldn't he have followed the news more closely, and wouldn't he have talked to Ron Allen more closely and tried to get the inside scoop on all of these things? But can I just ask you guys something? Can I ask you something as a genuine challenge question? Why do you think Don would have had any contact at all with Arthur Lee Allen in January of 1968 if he believed the accusations of Allen molesting his daughter? Please put your ideas in the comment section down below. And right now I would like to get to your supporter shoutouts. Anybody can support this channel at buymeacoffee.com. buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88, and this allows you to make a donation or contribution to help the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out here on Zodiac Monday. And our first one comes to us from Batman66. Batman66, thank you so much for your regular and consistent support, and Batman66 has also been helping out a lot with the research for the show, and Batman66 provided me with something that I'm going to share with you guys right now. About a year ago, I put out a poll here on Black Box Online Radio where I said, what should the nickname of the Black Box Online Radio subscribers be? Because lots of shows have nicknames for their followers. For example, Brain Scratch had the Brain Scratchers, and the Stones Unturned podcast has the Lucky Devils, and even Lionel Nation had the Patriots. So, what would be the nickname to those who follow Black Box Online Radio? And I put out some polling choices. Of course, the name Black Boxers was the first thing that I thought of, but that's just too obvious. And it was Batman66 who actually suggested the name Black Box Battalion. So, I would like to say, welcome, Black Box Battalion. That's you guys. That is the now new official nickname for the subscribers of Black Box Online Radio. And if you listen to this program and you haven't subscribed yet, please do so. It's very good for Black Box Online Radio. You can join the Black Box Battalion. Doesn't that just have an amazing ring to it? Well, thank you for that, Batman66. And we have our next shout-out going to River Prawn Pottery, another regular and consistent supporter. River Prawn Pottery, thank you for absolutely everything. And of course, we have CZ Guy. CZ Guy is also a regular and consistent supporter. You three are amazing. You've really just always wanted to share things and help support the show, and I'm really appreciative that you want to support all of my efforts making content for Black Box Online Radio. And some new things that are going to be happening is the return of True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. Yes, True Crime Talk Radio in the morning is the live stream show that I do on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and I brought it back in March, but some things happened. I was doing the JonBenet Ramsey series, and last week I did the interview with Sonnet Daymont. So I released the second part of the interview last Thursday, but for the month of May there will be a solid return of True Crime Talk Radio in the morning, coming to you every Tuesday and Thursday, and those are going to be live streams that are going to focus on things like forensics, criminology, and criminal psychology, so you can put anything you want in the chat, and if someone wants to talk about the Zodiac Killer, they can. If they want to talk about Jack the Ripper or D.B. Cooper, then they can as well. And I also would like to give a big shout out to Dennis G, who has been helping find a lot of the materials that are used in the show. Dennis G has been sending me a lot of the images that you see going by on the screen, and, Dennis sends this stuff every week, and I should be giving Dennis a lot more shout outs than I do. So, thank you so much, and also thank you to anyone who has ever supported the channel in the past, and thank you one more time to all of you who are a part of the Black Box Battalion. I just like saying that. I'm saying it over and over again because it's a fun thing to say. And as for the Zodiac Killer news report, let's move on now with some other things, because in that set of questions that Drew Beeson was talking about, he asked a question about why would Lee Allen do something like creating the Zodiac Killer's Z32 cipher, something that clearly had a fair amount of thought that was put into it, and then just blab it all to Don Cheney. Why would he do that? And the honest answer is, I don't know, but it reminded me of something about the Z32 cipher, because one of the best true crime books that I've read over the last 12 months was The Zodiac, Murderers and Histories, Ciphers and Crimes by C.G. Karras. I have a standalone episode about it here on Black Box Online Radio, but there's a discussion on the Z32 cipher, and the Z32 talks about how there's a cipher with 32 symbols, and then it says the word radians, and the solution concerns inches along the radians, and it's talking about the location of a bomb. So, one interesting observation that was made by C.G. Karras in his book, The Zodiac Murderers and Histories, Ciphers and Crimes, is that, what if the Zodiac has fooled us all? Because a radian is an angle of 57.29 degrees, and that's rounded off. But what if the Zodiac was up to his old shenanigans and trying to deceive us? What if he didn't even mean radians? Because there's a much more common word in the English language, and that is radius. And the plural of radius is radii. And was the Zodiac just kind of feigning ignorance of the word? And if you were to look at the map that is coupled with the code, you have the Phillips 66 map, and it has a type of, not exactly a compass rose, it has a clock face on it, and that has the arrow pointing upward, and then 3, 6, and 9. It really is a clock face, and that's what other people are talking about, saying, whoa, wait a second. If you want to put radians and inches along the radians, that's not even how you would draw out something in in terms of graph paper. If you're trying to make a mathematical graph, you're going to have the quadrants listed from right to left, 1, 2, 3, and 4, not 3, 6, and 9. But the arrow points upward. And if you're going to be looking at the radius, not the radians, in inches along the radius or radii, you get a very interesting landmark that has been identified, and that is the arrowhead marina. Firstly, you have the arrow pointing upward, arrowhead, and I mean, it's fascinating, and I really like the way that C.G. Karras thinks with some of these things. Of course, I can't certify a solution like that, but it says Arrowhead Marina. That could have been the location of the bomb. What do you guys think about that? And, feel free to check out my full book discussion on the Zodiac, Murderers in History, Ciphers, and Crimes, here on Black Box Online Radio. And the next thing that I have for you is also talking about the ciphers. Recently, I've been talking a lot about the Zodiac Killer Z13 cipher, so I was really glad that I got to revisit that stuff from C.G. Karras and the Z32, but there are two unconfirmed Zodiac ciphers where the solution has never been decoded to everyone's satisfaction, and someone on the website Vertex Mover made an attempt to decode the Z13, and firstly, you have to use the letters that are arranged in the English language that say his count. Because I admit this, the Zodiac Killer definitely used numbers in his letters. He used it as the cross circle sign off, and he would put a number there, which some people believe was a body count, that he's talking about how many victims he had murdered, but other people think that there's actually a much larger mathematical reason why the Zodiac Killer was doing this. But the Z13 has multiple letters in it and multiple symbols. There are 3 circled 8s, which represent the letter H, and then the letter A represents the English letter I, E is S, K is C, N is O, the Aries symbol is a U, the M is N, and the Zodiac symbol is T. And then, if you were to ascribe these letters to the symbols, firstly it spells out his count, and then if you were to take the letters from the Z13 and rearrange them, you get the name John Hutchison. And you might be noticing something. You can see it right there on the screen. It actually says Ion Hutchinson. The J is in the wrong place. Or the letter I represents the letter A, right? But then that means that it needs to begin with the letter I, and it's actually Ion Hutchinson. So it's very close, but it's off by 1 letter. And I'm sharing this with you because this is just something that I have noticed recently about the Z13, that so many of us have tried to solve the Z13, but it just doesn't work out perfectly. I mean, on some recent Zodiac Killer news reports, I was talking about Dr. Garlick's solution to this when he says that it's Dr. Ida Tot Pedo. It's supposed to be Ida Torpedo, but it doesn't work out exactly. You have to alter the letters. You have to turn one of the T's into the letter R, so it says Dr. Rita Torpedo. It's off by 1 letter. And a couple weeks before that, I tried to solve the Z13 cipher, and I came up with, my name is Zodiac, I'm not an idiot. But again, it doesn't work out perfectly. Mine says, my name is Zodiac, I'm not ad idiot, A-D instead of A-N. So the whole point is that these solutions make so much sense when someone is trying to do them, when you understand the metric and you understand what the person is doing. And with mine, it was really quite simple. I took the Zodiac symbol that is used there, and then I just unscrambled a message from the English language, much the same way that this person from Vertex Mover did, assigning certain letters to the symbols, and you could just unscramble it and get Zodiac, I'm not ad idiot. But it doesn't work perfectly. So with all of them, mine, Dr. Garlick's, Vertex Mover's solution, I'm noticing the imperfections, and I think that it's quite possible that the Zodiac would have put in a little bit more effort into creating the Z13, where the solution could have worked out neatly, it could have worked out perfectly, and you wouldn't have to modify your own solutions at the end, like say for example, changing the letter I to a J. You would just have to know what name you're looking for. Oh, you're looking for the English name John, so it actually says Ion Hutchison. Well, obviously you have to change the I to the J. That's an imperfection, it's also an assumption, and all 3 of the solutions that I've just been talking about are assumptive when you have to self-correct it. So I'm thinking that the Zodiac Killer may have had a more correct solution, unless the Zodiac was up to those old shenanigans again, like I was just talking to you about, and he wanted to do something that was insanely trolling, and he misspelled the solution. But what do you guys think? I would love to know. Put your ideas in the comments section down below. What do you think about the solution to the Zodiac Z13 cipher? My name is John Hutchison. And I also have one more thing for you guys here. And this comes to us from the Facebook group, The Search for the Zodiac. And it's going to be talking about a news article that was found. And the Search for the Zodiac is run by Chad Burke. And recently, he posted something about the Zodiac Killer suspect Edward Wayne Edwards, who was a real serial killer. And Edward Wayne Edwards spent time in Deer Lodge Prison in Montana. And he was also trying to find out, by he, I mean Chad Burke was trying to find out, if Edward Wayne Edwards may have known somebody in this prison who was the Zodiac, or knew somebody that could have been some type of advisor on the material that was discussed in the Zodiac's letters. So let's look at this article that was found and shared by Chad Burke. And this is going to be talking about someone who has a similar name to the last suspect he mentioned. The guy that he found that was living in Florida was named Richard Parker, and I've talked about him on a recent Zodiac news report. Well, this is another Deer Lodge inmate named Richard Manley, and let's have a look here. Deer Lodge was one of the prisons mentioned by a man who is believed to be Zodiac in September of 1969 when he stabbed two college students near a California lake. One of them, Brian Hartnell told the police, was a man wearing a mask that would mention the prison before the couple was tied up and stabbed. Hartnell 7 times, and then the girl was stabbed with a knife, and she died 2 days later. The man I knew had the first name Richard when we were in jail. I can't remember his last name, said an Akronite. The Zodiac carved initials RH into a library study desk at Riverside City College when an 18-year-old co-ed was last seen alive. Police found her body on Halloween in 1966 in a parking lot. Her throat had been slashed with such intensity that it almost decapitated her. The initials, along with an eerie poem, were verified as Zodiac's handwriting. Oh, they say that, but I don't think this RH thing on the desktop poem was the Zodiac at all. I was in Deer Lodge Prison with Richard from 1956 to 1959, said an Akronite, and he was something of a nut. But Richard was very shy and was bullied by the other inmates. Maybe Richard, if he is Zodiac, became tired of being pushed around and rebelled. Richard worked as an auto mechanic, the Akronite said, but his passion seemed to be reading. The prison library had many of Richard's favorite books, and he showed a strong interest in Egyptian history. Some of the Zodiac's secret codes have been influenced by an apparent reading of astrology and uses symbols from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. The police say that they have a study of the rambling messages, and they were sent to the California newspaper. The Akronite does not know when Richard left jail. Now, as far as this individual, Richard Parker, he appears to have been a trucker who was working in Florida, but also moving around the country. Richard Manley is someone who is now on Chad Burke's radar, but he would have been considerably older. Looking at a document that Chad shared in his Facebook group, The Search for Zodiac, Richard Manley went into Deer Lodge Prison in 1921, so he most likely would have been a very intense senior citizen during the time of the Zodiac crimes. And moreover, if we look at the document that Chad shared about Richard Manley, then he had a shoe size that's listed as 7.5, and the Zodiac wore a size 10.5 at Lake Berryessa, so almost certainly Richard Manley was not the Zodiac Killer. And I brought this stuff to Chad's attention. He's saying, oh yes, but he may have been someone who was advising the Zodiac, as well as this thing here. We have these suspects now, Ed Edwards, Richard Manley, Richard Parker, with connections to Deer Lodge Prison. And it seems like things they had in Deer Lodge Prison were the Egyptian Book of the Dead and books on Egyptian mythology. It looks more and more likely that the Zodiac Killer was somebody who was fascinated by just Egyptian history in general, Egyptian mythology, looking at the stories of the gods and goddesses of ancient Egypt. Now also possibly ancient Greece. But in the Zodiac Killer's 408 cipher, the Zodiac says that he wants to kill people so he can collect slaves for the afterlife. When he dies, he'll be reborn in paradise, and those whom he has killed will be his slaves. So some people think that he's trying to become an Egyptian pharaoh, because that was the whole process for the mummification in the sarcophagus. They wanted to be reborn in paradise. They wanted to be reborn in the afterlife. And also talking about having slaves in the afterlife. That was also a belief from ancient Egypt. So I'm seeing more and more things that are just compounding about how the Zodiac Killer may have genuinely believed this. He may have been somebody who was actually trying to take this stuff from Egyptian mythology. Now, one thing that I can do for a future episode of Zodiac Monday is perhaps go through the Egyptian Book of the Dead and try to find some set of symbols that could be relevant or similar to what's been used by the Zodiac Killer. As of now, I don't have enough knowledge to say that that's what the Zodiac was using. But to be honest, I think the Zodiac took symbols from perhaps code books, and he inserted other symbols of his own choosing, most notably the Aries sign in the Z13, and also the circled 8 in the Z13. There could be various reasons for that, but as for now, I'm just going to say that I don't really think that this Richard Manley is a strong suspect. In fact, he's mostly eliminated in my book. But Richard Parker was someone whom I talked about on a previous Zodiac news report, and Richard Parker may have been someone who actually is the Richard that's discussed in the Akron article. But as for now, I'm going to turn it over to you guys. One more time, share anything you want in the comments section, and welcome to the Black Box Battalion. I love saying that. Anybody can write the show at blackboxonlineradio@AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is Ned DeHaan, and there's also a Black Box Online Radio Facebook page. And I release shorts and reels on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. On TikTok and Instagram, you can get them under the name blackboxned88. And I will be with you guys live tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. That is all for me now. Goodbye.